For 10 years, my daughter-in-law spread vicious lies, turning my own family against me. But when my little antique shop boomed and I bought a $3 million penthouse, she dragged my son to my door, begging to move in. I smiled and handed her a small surprise that made her scream until the police arrived. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. My name is Raymond Foster. I'm 64 years old, and I own a small antique shop on King Street in Charleston, South Carolina. Foster's Antiques and Rare Finds, that's the name on the door, has been for 18 years now. I restore old clocks in my spare time. Over 40 of them line the walls of my workshop at home, each one ticking at its own pace, each one telling the truth in its own way. Clocks never lie. People are a different story entirely. 10 years ago, my son Chris brought home a woman named Nicole Vasquez. She was 28 at the time, bright smile, warm handshake, the kind of laugh that made you feel like you just told the funniest joke in the room. She remembered everyone's birthday. She brought homemade empanadas to family dinners. She called me Dad before the wedding, and I liked it. I thought Chris had found someone real. The wedding was beautiful. Small ceremony, garden reception, twinkling lights strung between the oak trees. My sister Louise cried happy tears. I gave a toast about how every family is like a clock. Each part has to move in harmony, or the whole thing stops working. Nicole hugged me afterward and whispered, "I'm so lucky to have you as a father-in-law." I believed her. Every single word. The first year was fine. Better than fine, actually. Sunday dinners at my place. Nicole would help me clean up while Chris dozed off on the couch. She'd ask about the shop, about the clocks, about pieces I was restoring. She seemed genuinely interested. Or maybe she was just studying me, learning which strings to pull later. The change didn't arrive like a storm. It crept in like mold behind wallpaper, invisible until the damage was done. It started with a phone call from my cousin Gerald, about a year after the wedding. His voice was careful, measured. "Raymond, is it true you refused to help Chris pay for his medication?" I nearly dropped the phone. "What medication?" I asked. Gerald went quiet. "Nicole said Chris was sick last month and you wouldn't give them money for the doctor." Chris had never been sick. Chris had never asked me for a single dollar. I called Chris that evening. He laughed it off. "Oh, Nicole probably just misunderstood something, Dad. You know how it is?" I let it go. That was my first mistake. Then Louise stopped returning my calls. My own sister, the woman I'd shared a childhood with, who knew me better than anyone alive. 1 week she was fine. The next, silence. I left voicemails. I sent texts. Nothing. When I finally reached her 3 months later, her voice was cold. "I think you need to work on yourself, Raymond. That's all I'm going to say." The line went dead. I sat in my shop for an hour after that call, staring at a grandfather clock from 1887, listening to it tick, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. The answer, of course, was nothing, but I didn't know that yet. The hits kept coming. Thanksgiving that year, no invitation from Chris. Christmas, a brief, awkward visit where Nicole spent the entire time on her phone and Chris barely looked me in the eye. My birthday, a text message, just a text. "Happy birthday, Dad." No call, no visit, no cake with candles like the year before. Then came the family reunion. Summer, a few years into the marriage. My cousin Roy, a man I'd known since we were boys catching crawfish in the creek, walked up to me at the barbecue, looked me dead in the face, and said, "You've destroyed your family, Raymond. Everyone knows it." His wife pulled him away before I could respond. I stood there holding a paper plate of potato salad, 60 years old, surrounded by relatives who wouldn't meet my eyes. That night, I sat alone in my apartment above the shop and tried to make a list of everything I'd supposedly done. Refused money for medicine, been aggressive at some dinner I didn't remember, said something cruel to Nicole that I'd never said. The list didn't make sense because none of it had happened. But the damage was real. The silence was real. The moment that changed everything came on a hot August evening. Chris and Nicole had invited me for a rare Sunday dinner, one of maybe 3 that year. I was in the living room with my grandson, a 5-year-old with his mother's dark eyes and his father's shy smile. We were putting together a puzzle, a picture of a lighthouse. The boy was concentrating so hard his tongue stuck out. I hadn't touched a drop of alcohol that day. Not a beer, not a glass of wine. Nothing. I'd had iced tea with lunch and water with dinner. Then I heard Nicole's voice drifting from the kitchen. She was on her phone speaking to someone. I couldn't tell who, but her words were perfectly clear. He's drunk again. Started yelling at the kids the moment he walked in. I don't know what to do anymore. Chris won't say anything to him because he's scared of his own father. It's getting dangerous, honestly. I sat perfectly still. My grandson looked up at me. "Grandpa, where does this piece go?" I pointed to the corner of the lighthouse. My hand was steady. My voice was calm. But inside, something shifted, like the mainspring of a clock, winding tight. Not breaking, not yet. Just storing energy. I stayed another 40 minutes. Smiled. Helped with the dishes. Kissed my grandson goodnight. Drove home under a sky full of stars. Parked behind the shop. Walked upstairs. Sat down at my workbench. And I understood, with the clarity of a clock striking midnight, that this was not a misunderstanding. This was not miscommunication. This was not Nicole exaggerating or being dramatic. This was a system, carefully built, deliberately maintained, running like clockwork for years. And I decided, sitting there among my silent clocks, that I was going to take it apart, piece by piece. There's a particular kind of patience required to restore a clock that hasn't run in a century. You can't rush it. You can't force a rusted gear. You sit with the mechanism, you study its logic, you figure out what's broken and what's merely stuck, and then you work, slowly, methodically, one component at a time. That's exactly how I approached the next 5 years of my life. The morning after I overheard Nicole's phone call, I drove to an electronics store on the other side of town and bought a simple digital voice recorder. $42. Best investment I ever made. I also bought a thick notebook, the kind with numbered pages that can't be torn out without leaving evidence, and I started writing everything down. Dates, times, names, direct quotes when I could remember them, who said what, who was present, what the context was, every phone call from a confused relative, every canceled invitation, every cold look from someone who used to smile at me. I wasn't angry. Anger makes you sloppy. Anger makes you loud. I was something else entirely. I was awake. For the first time in years, I could see the machine that had been operating in the dark, and now I was mapping its gears. The shop was changing during those years. What had started as a hobby was becoming a real business. I found a Victorian writing desk at an estate sale in Savannah, recognized the maker's mark, spent 3 weeks restoring it, sold it to a collector in New York for $47,000. That sale put me on the map. Serious buyers started calling, dealers from Atlanta, Boston, London. The shop that Nicole probably described as the old man's dusty hobby was quietly becoming something else entirely. But while my business grew, so did her campaign. A rainy afternoon, maybe 2 years after the phone call incident. I was behind the counter when Margaret Chen walked in, a woman I knew from the neighborhood. She browsed for a few minutes, then approached with a porcelain figurine. As I was wrapping it, she said casually, "I didn't realize you had such a difficult relationship with your family, Raymond. It must be hard." I kept wrapping. "Who told you that, Margaret?" "Oh, I'm in a mother's group on Facebook with your daughter-in-law. She posted something." She trailed off, suddenly aware she'd stepped into uncomfortable territory. "Never mind. It's none of my business." After she left, I locked the front door, turned the sign to closed, and sat behind the counter for a long time. She'd taken it public. This wasn't whispers at family dinners anymore. Nicole was broadcasting her version of me to strangers on the internet. A private Facebook group, but in a city the size of Charleston, private is a relative term. My customers might be reading about what a dangerous, unstable man I was, my business contacts, my neighbors. I thought about Chris, my son, the boy who used to sit on my workbench and watch me take clocks apart, asking what each piece did. The young man who once told me he wanted to be a photographer had a real eye for it, beautiful compositions, interesting angles. He'd stopped taking photos after the wedding, stopped visiting the shop, not because he'd changed, but because someone had convinced him that the man who raised him was someone to fear. I needed a professional. I contacted the Charleston Bar Association and asked for a referral to a private investigator with civil litigation experience. They gave me 3 names. I chose Derek Wallace, a 52-year-old former Charleston PD detective with a face like a closed file cabinet and a handshake that meant business. We met at his office on Rutledge Avenue. Small room, clean desk, no photographs on the walls. I laid out my situation in 15 minutes. Wallace listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked 2 questions. How far back does this go? And how much documentation do you have? I placed my notebook on his desk. 4 years of entries. Wallace flipped through a few pages and looked at me with something that might have been respect. I'll need a retainer of $4,500, he said. I wrote the check that afternoon. 3 weeks later, Wallace called me to his office. A manila folder sat on his desk, thick, maybe 2 inches. He slid it toward me and said one sentence. She doesn't realize she leaves trails. Inside were printouts, screenshots, timestamps, cross-references. Nicole's Facebook posts, not just the one Margaret had mentioned, but others. Messages she'd sent to my relatives. A timeline that matched my notebook entry for entry, and then went further, filling in gaps I hadn't even known existed. I closed the folder, looked at Wallace. This is the beginning, I said. I want to keep building it, until every lie has a date, a source, and a witness. And then I want to walk into a lawyer's office and put it on his desk. Wallace leaned back. That could take a while. I tucked the folder under my arm and headed for the door. I've been patient for 10 years, Mr. Wallace. I can be patient a little longer. Outside, King Street was busy with tourists. I walked back to my shop and went straight to my workbench. There was a pocket watch waiting, an 1890s Waltham with a cracked crystal and a movement that hadn't ticked in decades. I picked up my tools and got to work, on the watch, and on everything else. Wallace and I worked together for months, quietly, steadily, like 2 clockmakers rebuilding a mechanism that someone else had deliberately sabotaged. He'd deliver reports, I'd cross-reference them with my notebook, and the folder grew thicker with every passing week. Meanwhile, I had a business to run, and the business was about to change my life. It started with a phone call from an estate attorney in Savannah. An elderly collector had passed away, and his family wanted to liquidate his collection of Victorian silver. 847 pieces. Tea services, candelabras, flatware sets, decorative objects. All meticulously catalogued, all museum quality. The attorney asked if I'd be interested in appraising the lot. I drove to Savannah the next morning, spent 3 days in a climate-controlled warehouse, examining every piece with a loupe and a flashlight. By the end of the 3rd day, I knew what I was looking at, one of the finest private collections of Victorian silver in the American Southeast, conservatively worth over $1.5 million at auction. The family wanted a clean, fast sale. No public auction, no fuss. I offered $380,000 for the entire lot. They accepted. Then I made some calls, discreet ones, to dealers I'd built relationships with over the years, buyers in Switzerland, collectors in London, a museum curator in Edinburgh. Within 6 weeks, every piece had a new home. Total sales, $1,620,000. Net profit after the purchase, $1,240,000. 11 days after the last wire transfer cleared, I sat in a realtor's office on East Bay Street and signed a purchase agreement for a penthouse on the 14th floor of the Dewey's Tower. $3 million. I used the silver profit plus $760,000 from my own savings as a down payment and took out a 15-year mortgage for the rest. The realtor shook my hand and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Foster." I thanked her and drove back to my rented apartment, the same modest place I'd been living in since Chris stopped inviting me for Sunday dinners. Now, here's the thing about Charleston. It's a beautiful city, but it's a small one. News travels fast, especially news about a $3 million penthouse purchase. I knew exactly how fast it would travel, and I knew exactly where it would land first. The very next evening, my doorbell rang. I checked the time out of habit, 7:45. I walked to the door, looked through the peephole, and saw 2 faces I hadn't seen in months. My son Chris, standing slightly behind his wife Nicole, who was positioned front and center with the warmest smile I'd seen from her since the wedding. I opened the door. "Dad," Nicole practically sang. "We've missed you so much." I looked at her. Really looked at her. The smile was perfect. Practiced. Warm. Not a single wrong note. Her eyes, though, her eyes were doing math. I could almost see the calculations scrolling behind them. Penthouse. 3 million. Inheritance. Access. I said nothing for about 4 seconds. Then I smiled back. Not a fake smile, a real one. Because I'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "Wait right here," I said. "One moment." I turned and walked inside, went to my desk drawer, pulled out a large white envelope, thick, heavy, sealed. I'd prepared it 2 weeks ago. It had been sitting in that drawer like a loaded spring, waiting for the right hand to wind the clock. I walked back to the door and held it out to Nicole. "Here, I've been meaning to give you this. I thought you'd find it interesting." Nicole took the envelope with both hands. She was still smiling. Chris looked confused, but stayed quiet. That was his specialty, staying quiet. She broke the seal, pulled out the documents. The first page read, Raymond A. Foster versus Nicole Vasquez Foster, civil action for defamation, libel, and tortious interference with business relations. The lawsuit was for $380,000. Behind the 23-page filing were 67 pages of exhibits, screenshots, printouts, dated witness statements, audio transcription records, every lie, every Facebook post, every whispered conversation that she thought no one had been tracking. Nicole's smile didn't just fade, it collapsed, like a building whose foundation had been pulled out from under it. Her lips parted, her face went white. She looked up at me, then back down at the papers, then up at me again. For maybe 5 seconds, the world was perfectly silent. Then she screamed. Not a word, not a sentence, just a raw, high-pitched sound that echoed off the hallway walls and shot down the stairwell like a siren. She screamed the way people scream when they realize the ground beneath them is gone and there's nothing left to grab. Chris took a step back. His face was a mask of confusion and something else. Something I hadn't seen in years. Recognition. Like he was watching a puzzle come together, one piece at a time. And the picture was nothing like what he'd been told it would be. Nicole kept screaming. She threw the papers at my chest. They scattered across the hallway floor like white leaves. She grabbed Chris by the arm, screaming words now. Fragments, accusations, demands. Her voice bounced off the ceiling and traveled through the walls. I stood in the doorway, hands in my pockets, and waited. Somewhere in the building I heard a door open, then another. Then the distinct sound of someone picking up a phone. And I thought, right on schedule. It took the neighbors on the second floor about 7 minutes to call the police. I knew because I checked the clock on my kitchen wall when the screaming started. 7 minutes of Nicole's voice filling the hallway, a performance that would have been impressive if it weren't so predictable. 2 officers from the Charleston Police Department arrived roughly 10 minutes after that. I heard their boots on the stairs before I saw them. 2 men, mid-30s, professional. The taller one, the senior officer, took one look at the scene and started piecing it together. Here's what he saw. A 64-year-old man standing calmly in his doorway, hands in his pockets, expression neutral. A 38-year-old woman with tears streaming down her face, trembling hands clutching scattered legal documents. A 36-year-old man standing between them, frozen, saying nothing. Nicole turned to the officers like an actress hitting her mark. The tears were already flowing. I'll give her credit. She could summon them faster than anyone I've ever known. Her voice shook with exactly the right amount of fear. He threatened us, she said, pointing at me. He's been intimidating us. Please, we don't feel safe. The senior officer looked at me. I looked back at him. In another life, I might have felt nervous. But when you've spent 10 years being falsely accused of things you never did, being questioned by police for handing someone a legal document feels almost refreshing. I served her with civil court papers, I said. That's what she's holding. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I handed her an envelope, and she began screaming. The officer looked at Nicole, then at the papers on the floor, then at me, then back at Nicole. Ma'am, he said, can you tell me specifically what threat was made? Nicole's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Because there was no threat. There was no intimidation. There was a 64-year-old man in reading glasses who had handed his daughter-in-law a perfectly legal document in a perfectly calm manner. The only person who'd been screaming was her. He's trying to destroy our family, she managed. He's suing me for hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is harassment. Filing a civil lawsuit is not harassment, ma'am, the officer said. His voice was patient but firm. Is there anything else? Did he touch you? Block your exit? Make any verbal threats? Silence. Nicole looked at Chris, eyes wide, demanding backup. Chris stared at the floor. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to lower your voice, the officer continued. We've received a noise complaint from the building. Right now, the only disturbance I'm observing is coming from you. That's when Nicole cracked. Not toward me, toward Chris. Did you know about this? She hissed, grabbing his arm. Her voice was different now. No longer the frightened victim, but something harder, sharper. Did you know he was doing this? Answer me. Chris said nothing, but he looked at me, really looked at me. Maybe for the first time since the wedding, and I could see it in his eyes, that slow, terrible dawning. The father standing quietly in the doorway didn't match the monster from Nicole's stories. The calm man with the reading glasses and the organized legal filing didn't match the unstable, dangerous drunk she'd described to everyone who would listen. Something was breaking behind his eyes, or maybe something was finally being repaired. The officers documented the call. Noise complaint, civil dispute, no criminal conduct observed from the resident. They asked Nicole to leave the premises calmly. She grabbed Chris by the elbow and started pulling him toward the stairs. Chris took 2 steps, then stopped. I watched his shoulders tighten, watched his hand pull free from Nicole's grip. Gently but deliberately, he turned around. 7 years. That's how long it had been since my son had looked me in the eye without suspicion or distance. 7 years of silence, of canceled dinners, of text message birthdays, of standing on the opposite side of every room. 7 years of watching my boy disappear behind someone else's version of who I was. Dad, he said. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Can I come in? Nicole froze on the staircase. Chris, we're leaving. Now. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on me. I stood there for a long moment. Part of me, the part that had been wounded for a decade, wanted to say something sharp. Something about timing, about loyalty, about all those years when a single phone call would have changed everything. But that's not how clocks work. You don't punish a broken gear for being broken. You clean it, you set it in place, and you give it a chance to turn again. I stepped back from the doorway. Come in, I said. Sit down. This is going to be a long conversation. Chris walked past me into the apartment. Nicole stood on the stairs, mouth open, one hand still reaching for where his arm had been. I closed the door, quietly. The lock clicked into place with a soft, precise sound, like the last piece of a mechanism sliding home. I didn't say a word for the first 20 minutes, neither did Chris. I made coffee. 2 cups, black, no sugar, the way we both used to drink it before Nicole decided that caffeine after noon was toxic behavior. I set his cup on the table, sat down across from him, and placed Wallace's folder between us. Read it, I said. All of it. Take your time. Chris looked at the folder the way you'd look at a door you're not sure you want to open. His fingers hovered over the cover for a moment, hesitating, weighing, then he reached for it. I watched my son's face change over the next 3 hours. Not all at once. Slowly, like watching the tide come in. First came confusion as he flipped through the early pages. Then recognition. Then something darker. A kind of sickness that starts in the stomach and works its way up to the eyes. He saw the screenshots from the Facebook group. The one where Nicole had described me as a dangerous man with unpredictable behavior to hundreds of women in Charleston. He read those posts with his jaw tight and his knuckles white against the paper. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold. Then he found the printout of a message Nicole had sent to my sister Louise, 6 years earlier. I watched his eyes move across the text, a detailed description of an attack I'd supposedly made at a family gathering, an attack that never happened, an event that had never occurred, written with such specific detail, the time, The words I'd allegedly used, the way I'd allegedly raised my hand, that anyone reading it would have believed every word. Louise had believed it, for years. Chris set that page down carefully, as if it might shatter. Then came the audio transcription, the phone call from that summer evening, the one I'd overheard while sitting in the living room with my grandson, putting together a puzzle of a lighthouse. Nicole's voice captured by my small recorder, telling someone that I was drunk again and yelling at the children. Chris stared at that transcription for a long time. I knew what he was thinking because I could see the memory forming behind his eyes. His son on my lap, puzzle pieces scattered across the coffee table, my glass of iced tea sweating on a coaster. He'd been there that evening. He'd seen me with his own eyes, sober and quiet and happy. He knew. He left at 1:20 in the morning. He didn't say much, just, "I need to think, and I'll call you." He didn't look at me when he said it. He was staring at the floor, at a spot between his shoes, as if the answers he needed were hidden somewhere in the carpet. I didn't push. You can't rush a gear that's starting to turn for the first time in years. 3 days of silence followed. I didn't call him. I didn't text. I went to the shop every morning, served my customers, worked on my clocks, waited. It was the kind of waiting I'd become very good at, the kind where you know something is moving beneath the surface, even when the water looks still. On the third evening, my phone buzzed. One message from Chris, "I need to talk to Louise." 5 words. But I understood what they meant. He wasn't just questioning Nicole's story. He was going to the source. He wanted to hear from the people she'd manipulated, in their own words. My sister Louise, my own blood, who hadn't spoken to me in 4 years because of lies she'd been fed. Meanwhile, my attorney Glenn Morris, a 58-year-old civil litigation specialist, whose office on Church Street smelled like old leather and quiet confidence, was doing his own work. Morris had the kind of reputation that made other lawyers nervous. He didn't take cases he couldn't win, and he didn't win cases by being loud. He won them by being thorough. Morris started reaching out to witnesses. The first was Teresa Gomez, a 55-year-old woman who lived next door to Chris and Nicole on Ashley River Road. Teresa had heard things over the years, conversations through open windows, arguments in the driveway, phone calls made on the back porch. She'd never said anything because it wasn't her business. But when Morris showed her the documentation and explained the case, she agreed to provide a written statement. Her testimony was detailed, specific, and devastating. 2 more relatives came forward, people Nicole had cultivated and manipulated for years, who now looked at the evidence and realized they'd been used as instruments in someone else's campaign. They agreed to speak with Morris. Then, about a week after the envelope incident, a letter arrived at my shop. Expensive paper, heavy stock, a law firm's letterhead I didn't recognize. Patrick Holloway, Esquire, Nicole's new attorney, from one of the larger firms in Charleston. The letter demanded that I withdraw my baseless and malicious lawsuit immediately, or face the full legal consequences. I read it twice, folded it neatly, placed it in the folder with everything else. Then I picked up the phone and called Morris. "They responded," I said. Morris was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good. That means she's scared. Scared people make mistakes, Raymond. We just have to be ready when she makes hers." I hung up and looked at the clock on the wall behind the counter, an 1840s American banjo clock with a hand-painted glass panel. It was keeping perfect time. So was I. Holloway's first move was exactly what Morris had predicted. Within 2 weeks of receiving our lawsuit, Nicole's attorney filed a counterclaim. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. $150,000. The logic was transparent. If you can't win on the merits, try to scare the other side into backing down. File a counterclaim big enough to make them think twice. Make them worry about legal fees, about risk, about the possibility of losing. Morris called me the morning the counterclaim was served. "It's here," he said, "just like we discussed. And it's weak. There's no evidence of intentional distress. You served legal papers through legal channels. Everything we did was by the book. Holloway knows this. He's betting you'll get nervous and settle." I almost smiled. Nervous. That's what they thought I was. A quiet old man who'd fold at the first sign of pushback. The same assumption Nicole had been operating under for 10 years. The assumption that because I didn't yell, I wouldn't fight. People confuse silence with surrender. It's an expensive mistake. "We continue," I said. "We continue," Morris confirmed. But Nicole wasn't relying solely on her attorney. She had another weapon, one she'd been using effectively for a decade: the phone. 3 days after the counterclaim was filed, my sister Louise called me. The sound of her voice on the other end of the line was jarring. I had not heard it in 4 years. 4 years of silence, of unanswered messages, of birthday cards returned to sender. 4 years of wondering whether my own sister would ever speak to me again. "Raymond," her voice was cautious, careful, like she was testing whether the bridge would hold her weight. "Louise, Nicole called me," she said. She told me you're suing her, that you're trying to destroy their family over money, that this is all about the penthouse and making yourself look like the victim." There it was, Nicole's playbook, running like clockwork even now. The same strategy she'd used 100 times before. Get to people first, frame the narrative, make me the villain before I have a chance to speak. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, "Louise, I'm going to send you some documents. I'm not going to tell you what to think about them. I'm not going to argue Nicole's version or ask you to pick sides. Just read them, then decide for yourself." She didn't respond right away. I could hear her breathing. Quick, shallow, the way people breathe when they're standing at the edge of something they're not sure they want to jump into. "Okay," she said finally. "Send them." I mailed the package that afternoon, a carefully selected subset of the evidence, enough to tell the story, not so much that it would overwhelm. I included the Facebook posts, the message Nicole had sent to Louise herself years ago, the audio transcription, and the timeline Wallace had assembled. I sealed the envelope and drove to the post office myself. Then I waited. While I waited for Louise, something else happened, something I hadn't anticipated, and in 10 years of careful planning, there weren't many things that surprised me anymore. Chris hired his own attorney, not to fight me, to understand his legal position as a potential witness in the case. When Morris told me this over the phone, I had to sit down. My son, who had spent years avoiding conflict, choosing comfort over truth, letting Nicole steer every decision in their household, had walked into a lawyer's office on his own and asked for independent counsel. It meant one thing: he was preparing to tell the truth. In court, under oath, on the record. The boy who'd spent 7 years looking the other way was finally turning around. I don't know how Nicole found out. Maybe Chris told her directly. Maybe she saw the attorney's business card on the kitchen table. Maybe she overheard a phone call, the irony of which would not have been lost on me. But she found out. And for the first time in the 10 years I'd known her, Nicole lost control in a setting she couldn't manage. Not in front of a camera. Not on a phone call she knew someone might hear. Not in a Facebook group where she could craft her words carefully. At home, behind closed doors, where the only audience was the truth. I heard about it from Teresa Gomez, who heard it through the wall that separated their houses on Ashley River Road. Shouting, crying, things hitting the floor. Nicole's voice, not the smooth, controlled instrument she usually wielded, but something raw and jagged and desperate. Teresa couldn't make out every word, but she caught enough. "You're choosing him over me, and after everything I've done for this family." I thanked Teresa for telling me. Then I called Morris and relayed the information. He made a note in the file. Everything was a note now. Everything was evidence. Every outburst, every phone call, every desperate move, all of it went into the folder. 2 days later, my phone rang again. This time it was Morris, and his voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, something between professional satisfaction and genuine surprise. "Raymond," he said, "I just received a call from your sister Louise. She wants to meet with me." He paused. "She says she has something important to tell us, something about photographs." I set the phone down and looked out the window of my shop. King Street was quiet in the late afternoon light. A couple walked past holding hands. A horse-drawn carriage clattered by, the tour guide's voice floating through the glass, like a melody from another century. The clock on my wall ticked steadily. The gears were turning, all of them, and Nicole, for the first time, couldn't reach the winding key. Morris called me the following morning with a summary of Louise's meeting. He spoke carefully, the way attorneys do when they know the information they're delivering carries weight beyond the legal. "Your sister came in yesterday afternoon," he said. "She brought something with her. Raymond, I think you should hear this in person." I drove to his office on Church Street within the hour. The building was old Charleston, brick facade, iron railings, the kind of quiet elegance that doesn't announce itself. Morris was sitting behind his desk with a legal pad covered in notes and a look on his face I hadn't seen before. The look of a man who just found the missing piece of a puzzle he'd been working on for months. "Louise told me about photographs," he began. "Photographs that Nicole showed her years ago, supposedly receipts from a liquor store found in your car. The receipts were meant to prove you had a serious drinking problem. Louise said Nicole brought them to her in person, sat across from her at the kitchen table, and cried while showing them." I waited. Morris continued. "Louise believed it. For years, those photographs were the foundation of everything she thought about you. Every other claim Nicole made after that, the aggression, the instability, the supposed danger to the children, it all rested on those receipts. Because if you were secretly drinking that heavily, then everything else became plausible." "But," I said. Morris leaned forward. "Louise remembered a detail. The receipts had a date on them, a specific day in the spring, about 9 years ago. She didn't think much of it at the time, but when she read through the timeline we sent her, the one Wallace assembled, she noticed something." He paused. I could feel it coming, the click of a gear finding its position. "On that exact date, Raymond, you were in Colombia, at an antiques exhibition. There are registration documents, a hotel receipt, a fuel purchase on your credit card statement. You were 112 miles away from Charleston that day. You couldn't have been at any liquor store here. The receipts Nicole showed Louise were fabricated." I sat in Morris's leather chair and let that settle. Fabricated. Not exaggerated, not misremembered, not taken out of context. Manufactured from nothing. Nicole had created physical evidence, fake receipts with a real date, and presented them to my sister as proof of a problem that didn't exist. She'd sat across from Louise at her own kitchen table, with practiced tears streaming down her face, and handed her forged documents designed to destroy the bond between a brother and a sister. Morris was watching me. "This changes the nature of the case significantly," he said. "Defamation is one thing, but presenting fabricated physical evidence to damage someone's reputation and relationships, that crosses into fraud. I'm filing an amended complaint to include the fraud claim." I nodded slowly. "Do it." But that wasn't all. 2 days later, Wallace called with his own discovery, and this one hit differently. "I found something from about 3 years ago," Wallace said. His voice was flat, professional, but I could hear something underneath. "Nicole approached 2 of your relatives, your cousin Gerald and another family member, and asked them to sign what she called an informal letter describing your alleged mental decline. She used words like erratic behavior and cognitive issues. She framed it as a family concern, said she wanted documentation in case she ever needed to protect the grandchildren." I gripped the phone tighter. "What kind of documentation?" "The kind that could be used to challenge someone's legal competency." Neither of them signed it. Gerald told me he thought it was strange at the time, but didn't want to get involved. The other relative said the same thing, but they both remember the conversation clearly. I hung up the phone and sat in my workshop, surrounded by the steady ticking of 40 clocks. For the first time in this entire process, through years of documentation, through the hiring of Wallace, through the lawsuit, through the police visit, through watching my son's face crumble as he read the evidence, for the first time, I was truly still. She hadn't just been lying about me. She'd been building a case, a long-term methodical case to eventually have me declared incompetent, to take control of my estate, my business, my decisions. The lies weren't random, they were infrastructure. Every whisper, every Facebook post, every tearful conversation with a relative was a brick in a wall she'd been constructing around me. And the endgame wasn't just isolation. The endgame was control. I sat there until the light faded from the workshop window. Then I said quietly, to no one but the clocks, She planned this much further ahead than I ever imagined. Morris filed the amended complaint the next morning. The lawsuit now included fraud. The stakes had just doubled, and Nicole didn't even know it yet. About a month after Louise's revelation, the paperwork on the penthouse was finalized. I picked up the keys on a quiet Tuesday morning, a heavy set, attached to a leather fob with the building's logo embossed in gold. The Dewey's Tower, 14th floor, 4,200 square feet, floor-to-ceiling windows facing the harbor. The kind of address that makes real estate agents speak in reverent tones. The move took 3 days. I didn't hire a company. I did most of it myself, with help from 2 men who worked part-time at the shop. The furniture came first, then the books, then the artwork, and finally, the clocks. 43 of them, each one wrapped individually, each one placed in its designated spot throughout the apartment. The workshop took up the second bedroom, a room with east-facing windows where the morning light fell across the workbench at exactly the right angle. Standing in that penthouse for the first time with everything in place, looking out at the harbor where sailboats traced white lines across the blue, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not pride, something quieter than that. Something like recognition. Like the building knew I belonged there. Like I'd finally stopped apologizing for existing. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about the fact that a man who'd been called a failure, a drunk, a danger to his own grandchildren. That man was standing on the 14th floor of the finest building in Charleston, surrounded by the work of his hands and the truth of his life. And every clock in the room was running. Charleston is a small city. Word traveled fast. Within a week, everyone who mattered knew about the penthouse, including Nicole. But the moment that cut deepest for her came from an unexpected source. Chris visited me for lunch. The first meal we'd shared in 7 years. Just father and son, no tension, no agenda. He brought his old camera, a DSLR he hadn't touched in years. He took a photograph from the living room window, the harbor at golden hour, sailboats in the distance, the marshes glowing amber. He sent it to Nicole, not as a weapon, just as a picture. But she understood what it meant. Her husband was sitting in his father's $3 million penthouse, sharing a meal, taking photographs. The wall she'd built between us was crumbling. Holloway, Nicole's attorney, made his move within days. He called Morris with a settlement offer. Nicole would pay $85,000 and sign a non-disclosure agreement. In exchange, the lawsuit would disappear. No public record, no admission of wrongdoing. Clean slate. Morris relayed the offer. I didn't hesitate. No. Raymond, I want to make sure you understand. I understand perfectly. I don't want her money, Glenn. I want the truth on the record. I want a public admission that every word she said about me was a lie. I want it documented in a courtroom, not buried in an NDA. Morris was quiet for a moment. You realize that refusing settlement means we go to trial. That's more time, more expense, more risk. I've spent 10 years being called things I'm not. $85,000 doesn't fix that. A court record does. When Holloway received our rejection, I imagined the conversation with Nicole was unpleasant, because what followed was desperate. Within days, Nicole posted on her Instagram account, the one with 12,000 followers, the one where she'd built her image as the perfect mother, the mindful parent, the warm and nurturing family woman. The post was carefully worded, no names, no specifics, but the meaning was clear to anyone who knew the situation. Vague references to being persecuted by a family member, hints about emotional abuse from someone who should have been a protector, a call for support from her community. I didn't see the post myself. Teresa Gomez showed it to me the next morning, holding out her phone with a look that mixed sympathy with something sharper. I called Morris. He wasn't surprised. I've been waiting for this, he said. She's panicking. People who panic make public mistakes. Give me an hour. By that afternoon, Holloway had received an official legal warning from our side. Any public discussion of the case, direct or indirect, named or unnamed, could be considered an additional act of defamation and would be added to the existing complaint. The Instagram post was screenshotted, time-stamped, and filed as Exhibit 74. Nicole deleted the post within 2 hours. But the internet has a long memory, and Wallace had already preserved it through 3 separate archival services. The walls were closing in. She could feel it. I could feel it. And somewhere between the settlement rejection and the Instagram warning, Nicole must have realized the truth that terrified her most. I wasn't doing this for money. I was doing it for the record. And records, unlike Instagram posts, can't be deleted. The hearing was set for the following month. Morris was ready. Wallace's file was complete. The witnesses were prepared. And I, for the first time in 10 years, slept through the night without waking once. The Charleston County Courthouse smelled like floor polish and old wood. The hearing room was smaller than I had expected. No grand gallery, no dramatic columns. Just a compact room with fluorescent lighting, a judge's bench, 2 counsel tables, and rows of wooden seats that creaked when you shifted your weight. But the room was full. Louise sat in the second row, hands folded in her lap, back straight. Teresa Gomez was next to her, calm, resolute, a woman who'd spent years hearing things through her walls and was finally ready to say them out loud. 2 of my relatives sat behind them, the same ones Nicole had tried to recruit against me, now here to speak for me, and Chris. My son sat at the end of the 3rd row, alone, his jaw tight, his eyes focused on the front of the room. Nicole arrived with Holloway. She was wearing a beige suit, professional, understated, carefully chosen. Her expression was one I recognized instantly, the wounded innocent. Wide eyes, soft mouth, a slight furrow between the brows that suggested someone carrying a burden they didn't deserve. She'd been rehearsing this face for a decade. It was flawless. But this audience was different. These weren't strangers at a family dinner or anonymous women in a Facebook group. These were people who'd read the documents, who'd seen the evidence, who knew the difference between Nicole's performance and the truth. Morris stood up when the judge called our case. He was wearing his usual uniform, dark suit, white shirt, no flash. He didn't need flash. He had something better, a folder 3 inches thick and a timeline that read like a horror novel. He began with the chronology, not dramatically, quietly, methodically, the way you'd lay bricks, date by date, incident by incident, each lie documented, sourced, and cross-referenced. The room went silent. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for something interesting, the heavy silence of people hearing something they can't unhear. Then Morris produced the audio recording, the one from that summer evening years ago, the evening I'd been sitting in my living room with my grandson putting together a puzzle of a lighthouse, drinking iced tea, completely sober. He pressed play on a small speaker, and Nicole's voice filled the courtroom. He's drunk again, started yelling at the kids the moment he walked in. I don't know what to do anymore. The voice was clear, unmistakable, every word crisp and deliberate. I watched Nicole's face as she heard her own voice, played back to her in a room full of people who now knew the truth. The wounded innocent mask flickered, just for a second, and underneath it I saw something raw. Fear. Holloway was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. We challenge the admissibility of this recording. My client was not informed she was being recorded. The judge looked at Morris. Morris didn't hesitate. Your Honor, the recording was made in my client's own home, where he had every legal right to be present and to record. South Carolina law permits one-party consent recording. My client was that party. The judge considered this for a moment. Then, objection overruled. The recording is admissible. Holloway sat down. Nicole's knuckles were white against the edge of the table. Then it was Louise's turn. My sister walked to the witness chair with the careful posture of someone who knows the weight of what they're about to say. She described the photographs, the liquor store receipts Nicole had shown her years ago, the ones that had convinced her that her brother was a secret drinker, the ones that had destroyed our relationship for 4 years. I believed them, Louise said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. I believed every word Nicole told me, because she cried when she showed me those pictures. She seemed so genuinely worried about Raymond. Morris led her through the key detail, the date on the receipts, the same date that Raymond Foster was registered at an antiques exhibition in Columbia, 112 miles from Charleston. Hotel receipt, registration documents, credit card statements, physical impossibility. The receipts were fabricated, Louise said. Nicole created them, and I believed them for years. Holloway's cross-examination was aggressive but unfocused. He tried to challenge Louise's memory, her timeline, her motivations. Louise answered each question with the calm precision of a woman who'd already wrestled with every doubt. Nothing cracked, nothing wavered. When Louise returned to her seat, I watched Nicole lean toward Holloway and slide a small folded piece of paper across the table. A note. Holloway read it, looked at Nicole, and then looked at the judge. "Your Honor, we request a 15-minute recess." The judge granted it. 15 minutes. In the larger scope of a decade-long campaign of lies, 15 minutes is nothing. But in those 15 minutes, sitting in that small courthouse room while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, Nicole Vasquez Foster made a decision that would change everything. I sat at the counsel table next to Morris, hands folded, watching the clock on the wall. It was an old institutional clock, plain white face, black numbers, a second hand sweeping in steady circles. Nothing fancy, but keeping perfect time. Morris leaned over and whispered, "She's going to settle. Full terms." I looked at him. "How do you know?" He nodded toward the hallway where Nicole and Holloway had disappeared, because she just heard her own voice in a courtroom, and she knows what's coming next if she doesn't stop this now. The second hand swept around the dial. 15 minutes had never moved so slowly. When the recess ended, Holloway walked back into the courtroom with the posture of a man carrying something heavy. Nicole followed 2 steps behind. Her face had changed. The wounded innocent was gone. In its place was something I'd never seen from her before. Blankness. The look of someone who'd run out of masks. Holloway stood, straightened his tie, and spoke. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to agree to a full settlement." The room didn't gasp. It held its breath. Morris glanced at me. I gave him the smallest nod. The terms were negotiated over the next hour, right there in the courthouse. Morris had prepared for this possibility. He had a draft settlement agreement ready, with every condition I'd specified months earlier. Nothing left to chance. Nothing left to interpretation. Here's what Nicole agreed to. First, a written public apology, addressed to every family member and acquaintance she had deliberately deceived about me over the past decade. Not a vague expression of regret. A specific, detailed admission that her statements about my alleged drinking, my alleged aggression, and my alleged instability were false. Second, a payment of $210,000, $150,000 to me as compensation for reputational damage, damage to my name, my relationships, and my business. $60,000 to cover legal fees and investigation costs. Third, a formal, legally binding statement acknowledging that all prior claims she had made about Raymond Arthur Foster were untrue. Nicole signed each page with a pen that trembled slightly in her hand. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. She signed the way people sign things when the alternative is worse, mechanically, with the energy of someone who knows this is the best deal they're going to get. I signed my copies across the table. My hand was steady. The first thing I did after leaving the courthouse was drive to my shop on King Street. I sat behind the counter, opened my laptop, and navigated to the private Facebook group for Charleston mothers, the same group where Nicole had once posted about a dangerous father-in-law with unpredictable behavior. I'd been added to the group by Teresa Gomez, specifically for this purpose. I uploaded one document, Nicole's signed public apology. No commentary, no caption, no explanation, just the document, every word of it. Then I closed the laptop, locked the shop, and went home to my penthouse. A week passed, then Chris called. "Dad," he said. His voice sounded different, lighter somehow, like a man who'd finally set down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. "I wanted to tell you myself, before you heard it from anyone else. Nicole and I are getting a divorce. It's my decision. Not the court's, not yours. Mine. I should have opened my eyes a long time ago." I didn't say much. There wasn't much to say. My son was 36 years old, and for the first time in his adult life, he was making a decision that nobody else had made for him. He was finding his own voice, and that mattered more than any settlement or any apology ever could. "I'll be at the shop on Saturday," he said. I dug out my old camera. Thought maybe I'd take some pictures of the harbor. "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it. Louise came to the penthouse for the first time a few days later. She stood by the living room window, the one with the floor-to-ceiling glass that faces the harbor, and looked out at the water for a long time. The late afternoon sun painted everything gold. Sailboats moved slowly across the distance. The marshes glowed. She didn't say anything for several minutes. I let the silence sit. Some silences need room to breathe. Then she spoke. "I should have called you sooner, Raymond." I stood next to her, looking at the same view, the same harbor, the same light. "You called when you were ready," I said. "That's what matters." She nodded. We stood there together, brother and sister, 64 and 61, watching the harbor turn amber in the fading light. No more words were needed. That evening, after Louise left, I went to my workshop. The room was quiet except for the steady ticking of 43 clocks, each one keeping its own time, each one telling its own truth. I sat down at the workbench and picked up a pocket watch I'd been restoring for months. An old piece, battered case, scratched crystal, a movement that hadn't run in longer than I could guess. I'd replaced the mainspring, cleaned every gear, polished every jewel. It was ready. I wound it carefully. 3 turns of the crown. Then I held it in my palm and listened. The watch began to tick. Steady. Even. Precise. I set it down on the workbench and leaned back in my chair. Through the workshop window, the lights of Charleston Harbor glittered against the dark water. Somewhere out there, the world was turning, people were making choices, stories were beginning and ending. Mine had taken 10 years, but the clock was running now, and it was keeping perfect time. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.